Thank you for that very kind introduction. I'd like to congratulate all the organisers on what has so far been, and I'm sure will continue to be, such a well-run hybrid conference. I'm only sorry that I can't be with you in the in-person part of the hybrid conference in Singapore. I haven't left Thailand for the last 20 months, so I'm looking forward to travelling soon. I'd also like to thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about drug resistance and malaria, and to give you a brief update on what's going on. I'm going to be hopefully changing my slides using this clicker thing. I'm going to be... Can I ask somebody to put my slides forward, please? Thank you. I'm going to be focusing on falciparum malaria. And just to start by saying, why are we so interested in drug resistance in malaria here in Southeast Asia? Most malaria in the world is in Africa. It's because antimalarial drug resistance generally emerges first in low transmission areas, such as the situation we have in most of Southeast Asia. And twice, in two very well documented cases, drug resistance has started in Southeast Asia and spread to Africa, where it's caused hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of deaths. Once in the case of chloroquine resistance, and then in the case of sulfadoxine pyrimethamine resistance. So that's why we have to keep an eye on things here, because obviously the main burden of malaria is in Africa. Next slide, please. And why is antimalarial drug resistance important? It's because it's associated with an increase in mortality. This very nice paper looking at malaria and non-malarial mortality in Africa, in West and East and South Africa in the 1980s and the 1980s, shows that as chloroquine resistance spread into East and South Africa in the 1990s, there was an increase in malaria mortality, you can see on the left, at the same time a decrease in non-malaria mortality, so it went against the trend. So this is why we're concerned. Next slide, please. Multidrug resistant falciparum reached a crescendo in the late 80s, early 90s in Southeast Asia. Here you've got some nice diagrammatic representation from the Thai-Myanmar border. You can see all the drugs falling to resistance. And we were saved by the artemisinins, and in particular the artemisinin combination therapies, where you have a long-acting partner drug associated with the rapid-acting artemisinins. You can see on the right this meta-analysis of many studies showing that ACTs are better in terms of reducing parasitical failure at day 28. So these then became the standard treatment from 2006 onwards around the world for the treatment of falciparum malaria, non-severe falciparum malaria. And artesunate subsequently became the treatment of choice for severe malaria. Next slide, please. So these are the artemisinin-based combination therapies that are approved by WHO. I won't read through them, you're probably familiar with most of them. Next, please. But, of course, all good things come to an end, and in the 2000s, partial resistance, as I think lots of people like to call it, to the artemisinins appeared in Cambodia, in Western Cambodia. On the left, you can see a study which we did back in 2008, led by Arian Dondorp, and you can see the characteristic delayed parasite clearance that you see with artemisinin resistance. And soon the Pasteur Institute discovered a molecular marker in the CALCH13 gene of the parasite in the propeller regions, and multiple mutations in the propeller regions were associated with slow parasite clearance. And it was initially a soft sweep with multiple different independent mutations being seen in Cambodia and other parts of the Greater Mekong Subregion. Next slide, please. What the effect was that the artemisinins, which are fantastic antimalarial drugs, that they have this rapid and potent action because they have a very broad range of action against multiple stages, including the ring stage of the parasite. They're also gametocytocidal. And next slide, please. Next slide, please. And the effect of artemisinin resistance. Oh, sorry. I think I was just delayed because of the delay in the system. Apologies. Was to improve the survivability of the rings. So the ring stages were not as sensitive to artemisinin as before, turning artemisinin back into an old-fashioned antimalarial drug like quinine. So it's partial resistance. Next slide, please. So why is this important? It's because it's a prelude to partner drug resistance. And this has happened repeatedly now. Here you have on the Thai-Myanmar border artesunate mefloquine resistance occurring with resistance to both artemisinin and mefloquine, bottom purple line, leading to very high recrudescence. And this occurred following the initial introduction into the appearance in that area of artemisinin resistance with culture mutations. Next slide, please. Same happens with happened with piperacin. Piperacin resistance with this marker of plasmepsin amplification occurred in Cambodia, where dihydroartemisinin piperacin was the standard treatment. And you can see that a small increase in piperacin MIC leads to a big decrease in the time the concentration is above the MIC. That then means that the parasites that have not been killed off by the artemisinin are exposed to lower concentrations of piperacin, the unprotected partner drug. So that's been a major problem in Cambodia. Next slide, please. Apologies. And so now we've got very high failure rates with GHA piperacin in Eastern GMS. You can see here that in Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, and West Cambodia, we've got recrudescence rates much higher than the WHO efficacy level was thought to be acceptable efficacy of 90%. Next slide, please. So why do we have this development frequently of multi-drug resistant falciparum malaria in the Greater Mekong Subregion? And to ask this question, which was asked more than 2 decades ago, is there an accelerated resistance to multiple drugs phenotype? And there's some suggestion that this is true. I mean, there appears to be a genetic backbone. This work from Oliver Miotto and Dominic Kwiatkowski and at GWAS, where multiple resistance genes seem to be all aligned together in artemisinin resistant parasites. And artemisinin resistance also is associated with various phenotypic changes, such as an enhanced DNA repair phenotype and an upregulated unfolded protein response. So maybe there's something in the genetic backbone of the parasite which is not then broken up by recombination because of low transmission that leads to a greater ease of developing multi-drug resistance in these parasites compared with other parts of the world with higher transmission. Next slide, please. And artemisinin resistance is associated with gametocytemia and there's upregulation of the AP2G, which is the master regulator of gameto cytogenesis in the PF culture 13 mutants looked at by Zibi Bosdek of NTU. Next slide, please. So this then leads to this vicious cycle with rapid spread of resistance leading to recrudescent infections, increased gametocytemia, which you get in recrudescent infections, leading to increased transmission, larger reservoir, more clinical cases, more morbidity and mortality, more drug is used, more greater exposure to the parasites, leads to further resistance, etc. Next slide, please. So this is the current situation in the Greater Mekong Subregion. You've got in the west, you've got a C580Y mutation and a F446I in Burma and Western Thailand, in Myanmar. And this C580Y, which is the dominant, most worrying one, is different. It's on a different genetic background to the one that emerged in Lin initially, and actually outcompeted all the other KELPS 13 mutants. And you've now had a hard sweep, initially a soft sweep, a hard sweep of this parasite lineage, for want of a better term, which has picked up piperacin resistance and swept through northern Cambodia into Vietnam and southern Laos, and a little bit of northeastern Thailand as well. And currently we've got an outbreak in Attapur in southern Laos, which it doesn't seem to be responding as well as it should do to artemisinin, but that needs further investigation. Next, please. So this is from the World Malaria Report from 3 years ago, situation of ACT sensitivity in the Greater Mekong Subregion, and you can see that it's not a particularly good situation with up to 4 ACTs failing, depending on the location. Next slide, please. So the big fear was that this would spread through India and on to Africa. Is there any evidence for that? Well, we have seen, well, the colleagues in India have seen artemisinin resistant parasites in northeastern India, in West Bengal. And in the TACT study, which is a multi-center study, which includes Midnapur, we've also seen further KELPS 13 mutations, but there doesn't seem to be any selective sweep. It hasn't amplified after 5 years. So at the moment, it doesn't seem to be taking hold in India, in northeast India. But obviously, we have to keep a watching brief on that. Next slide, please. And what about Africa itself? Well, in 2015, when Oliver Miotto and colleagues at Sanger did this study looking at which genes were under selective pressure in African P. falciparum, you can see that compared with Asia, where KELPS 13 was under a lot of selective pressure, it wasn't the case in Africa. There were the odd mutations arising, but they just arose and disappeared again. And that's generally been the way until recently. There are now some slightly worrying indications that there is some selection of particular parasites with KELPS mutations, particularly in Rwanda and in Uganda. Next slide, please. So this is the situation in Rwanda. So these parasites, which have got the R561H mutation, oh, yeah, thank you. They show slow parasite clearance. Artemisinin is still effective. There seems to be a selective sweep, and this lineage is being selected. So we have to watch this one carefully. And next slide, please. Similarly, in northern Uganda, very nice study from Gulu, published this year. You've seen two KELPS mutations which seem to have taken hold, and culture mutations generally have increased over the last 5 years from 3.9% in that area to nearly 20% in 2019. Next slide, please. What about South America? Well, a few years ago, there was a lot of concern about this C580Y, which is an independent emergence of that particular mutation in Guyana. It's continued to be a problem on and off, but doesn't seem to have been doesn't seem to have taken hold, and there's no evidence of serious selection in a big sweep. And it's possible that this is because it doesn't have the genetic backbone that we were discussing earlier from Southeast Asia. Maybe that there's more genetic diversity leading to more recombination. And there's some evidence that the C580Y mutants are not particularly fit, so maybe just be outcompeted. Next, please. We have to keep an eye on the situation in all endemic areas, and increasingly molecular and genomic methodologies are being used. There are lots of markers for resistance for particular drugs outlined here, and of course it's useful to look at the population genetics as well to see whether there are signals of a selective sweep showing that something is outcompeting others, likely due to, not necessarily, but likely due to resistance. Next slide, please. So what do we do with multidrug resistant malaria? What are the options that we've got? Well, one of the ones which we've been looking at, and I haven't gone into a lot of detail about it here, it is the triple artemisinin combination therapies. The idea being that you add a second long-acting partner drug so that they can protect each other. And there's artesunate, DHA, piperacin, and artemisinin, bifenthrin, amodiaquin are the two which we're looking at, but there are others as well, potentially possible. Arian Dondorp is leading a big multi-center study across Asia and in Africa, looking in detail at the feasibility of deploying these, side effects, acceptability, etc. Funded by the FCDO, used to be called DFID, I believe. But that's not the only potential way of dealing with this. It could just be that we need longer treatment regimens. I'm not sure that hasn't been looked into much. I think we did one study on that in Myanmar, but in fact they were equally efficacious. Having multiple first-line therapies or drug rotation is another option which has been well modeled and does seem to work well in reducing the onset and development of resistance. Sequential use in one patient of two different ACTs is another option, potentially. And of course, there's the drug pipeline. Next slide, please. So we've got these two exciting classes of drugs, spiroindolones and the imidazolpiperazines, and these are both very good antimalarials, very rapidly acting, and they're under development and are probably the ones nearest to registration, but it's still going to be quite a few years. So we probably don't have time to wait in the meantime. Next slide, please. So this just illustrates the reasoning behind the triple artemisinin combination therapies. You can see the lines. If you've got artemisinin resistance, you have that darker line in terms of the parasites. They're cleared less quickly, leaving a larger biomass of parasites to be cleared by the partner drug. So that's the cross-hatched area as opposed to the solid area. And of course, if you have a lot of parasites there being exposed to a single unprotected partner drug, you can see that that's asking for resistance to develop. Whereas if you protect the partner drug by having two pharmacokinetically matched partner drugs, then you're less likely to develop resistance to those two, and also to the it protects the artemisinin as well. Next slide, please. So this is going ahead in terms of development, and we've actually managed to get Fosun Pharma very kindly co-packaged artemethyl lumefantrine amidiaquine. We haven't got a fixed dose combination yet in a single tablet, but if this seems to be the way to go, then that could be developed. So this is actually in use now in the TACT study, development of triple artemisinin combination therapies. Next, please. But it's not all doom and gloom. If you look at the actual amount of malaria transmission in the Greater Mekong Subregion, it seems to be because of the well, multiple reasons, but not least the efforts of the various malaria control programs. It's decreasing. So even though we have had this problem with drug resistance, and I think that area in 2018 of dark red reflects the DHA piperacin resistance. Overall, the countries are doing quite well, and elimination is certainly on the cards, and that, of course, would be the best way to get rid of artemisinin-resistant malaria and multidrug-resistant malaria from the Greater Mekong Subregion, would be to eliminate it. Certainly, it's potentially possible from the eastern side of the GMS. Next slide, please. So, in conclusion, I think that we've seen this ongoing evolution of ACT resistance and ACT failure. And the most worrying thing, I think, is that there's independent, and I didn't really mention that, it hasn't spread like chloroquine and sulfadoxine-pyrimethamine resistance from Southeast Asia this time. It seems to be emerging independently in Africa. And what we're seeing now in northern Uganda and Rwanda and potentially other parts of the continent are slightly concerning. But there is hope. We've got the potential for malaria elimination in the eastern part of the GMS. ACTs are still effective in most parts of the world. I mean, artemethyl lumefantrine is a remarkable combination, seems to be effective almost everywhere in terms of just efficacy preventing recrudescence. There are triple ACTs as a possibility, other ways of combining ACTs, either at a patient level or a programmatic level. And of course, we've got the exciting new compounds in the pipeline. So I think I'll stop there if that's okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Fantastic talk and very nice updates on drug resistance in malaria and from a global perspective as well. We don't have any questions from the floor, but I do have one. We have about 2 minutes left. So do you think we'll ever see full-blown artemisinin resistance in P. falciparum?
You mean as opposed to the partial resistance we've seen so far?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way in which this resistance has manifested itself, by CALT, which is the chaperone protein, which then just seems to have effects on multiple systems. It's like there isn't a simple, clearly because of the explosive nature of artemisinin on the parasite, there isn't a simple way that, unlike with other drugs like chloroquine, etc., that the parasite can become resistant. So, I mean, you know, I'm not a parasite expert, but I believe that the evidence so far, it's unlikely that we will see full-blown artemisinin resistance in that way, which would be very worrying if we did. But you never say never. Resistance, you know, it's in microbiology, in parasitology, evolution always works in favor of the pathogen if we're not careful.
Thanks, Nick. Absolutely, I agree with you. I mean, theoretically, I don't think it will happen, but the parasite has always surprised us over the ages. So,
Indeed.
akan datang, more to come. Thank you very much, Nick, and hope to see you soon. Take care.